Good morning. My group is confirmed by Ana Sanchez, Daniela Garcia, Angie Sanchez, and who is speaking, Daniela Martinez. It's our responsibility to explain the fiscal system in Colombia, which is why it's understood as the set of taxes, especially taxes coordinated and harmonized, which each other based on specific fiscal or extra fiscal objectives. The fiscal system refers to a coherent set of taxes enlightened by principles that are applicable to all, which becomes a suitable way for citizens to comply with the obligation to pay taxes, contributing to the maintenance of state expenses and the satisfaction of certain constitutional purposes. We can see, for doing business, Colombia it has 58.6% out of 100 in relation to the tax payment score, compared to Latin American economies where the average is 60.5%. And it's evident that during the two reports in analysis, Colombia continues collecting most of its indirect taxes, which represents 51.9% of this type, compared to an average of 67.2% of the OECD countries. This means that the progressiveness of fiscal policy and the role that taxation can play as a redistributive instrument are limited, so direct taxes don't compensate for the regressivity of direct taxes. From 2020 to 2021, a new legal reform has been processed, adding 9 legal reforms in total during the last 10 years, which have served to modify the tax structure significantly. An example of this is the economic law, a law called Law 2010 of 2019, which maintained most of the measures contemplated by the financial law called Law 1943 of 2018, to give a reduction in the tax burden of companies and the greater progressivity of taxes to natural persons. Regarding indirect taxes of the national order, it's evident that in Colombia taxes are mostly collected from companies than from people, and comparing year to year, people increase a percentage point with respect to previous years. This is why if Colombia continue to maintain direct taxes only on companies, will continue to affect their investments, and not allowing discount to other taxes will generate increases in effective tax rates, which is in turn can affect companies' levels of competitiveness. In the graph, we can identify that the 79.9% of direct tax collection comes from companies, while for the average of OECD countries, that contribution is from investment, which is equivalent to 26.8%.
Okay, now regarding the recommendation in 2019 to 2020, we can find 4 recommendations. The first is to expand the threshold of natural person at the time of starting to pay income tax. There we can see the law of 1943, which simplifies the payment of tax on labor income, non-labor income, and capital income. The second is the tax on the pension income was left out when implementing the aforementioned law, but it's proposed that this tax be included as of a certain level of pension income. It's also recommended with respect to payroll taxes to reduce payroll costs by eliminating the payment of interest on severance payments and modifying the sources of financing for family compensation funds. Finally, it's recommended to promote the adoption of the simple taxation regime, since it unifies the consumption income tax and the industry and commerce tax, with the purpose of promoting formality and facilitating compliance with the tax obligation of small and medium-sized companies. On the other hand, in 2020 and 2021, we found 5 recommendations, which means one recommendation was added in comparison to the previous ones. With respect to the first recommendation remains the same, in which it seeks to expand the threshold of natural person at the time of starting to pay income tax and wants to maintain an increase in the collection for economic recovery by the COVID crisis of 2019. In the second recommendation also remains the same as the previous period, where people who have high pension have to pay taxes. In the third recommendation, there are no changes with respect to the previous period in order to continue encouraging formal employment and reduce informality. In the fourth recommendation, the RST is excluded for people who provide consulting services and scientists. And finally, they add the recommendation to review the national carbon tax in order to send signals to consumers and companies about the costs generated by the extensive use of fossil fuels.
Even though we are talking about different periods of the indirect taxes of the national order in Colombia, we will find out that on both periods we have similar trends between the recommendations and the behavior of the economy in Colombia, as we will see ahead. As we can see on both images of both periods, Colombia presents one of the lowest VAT collections levied in the region. We're taking as reference countries like Argentina, Peru, Uruguay, and even Costa Rica, and it's still the percentage that Colombia collects with these taxes are pretty lower, despite the increase that we have on the nominal VAT rate from 16% to 19% on 2016. As we talked before, part of the recommendations on both periods have plenty of similarities between them, as is the delete the tax on the financial movement signs. Some especially say that instead of being a protection measure, on these days, 20 years later, is more like a restriction measure that avoids and exclude some banks of the investments that we could get. Also, it's important to add more categories of foods and services inside the VAT taxes and only exclude part of the goods and services that are exported. This will help to increase the amount of collected money from the VAT and also impulse or promote the investments for exported products of Colombia. It's important to take into account that if we keep promoting the exemptions and exclusions, we'll keep encouraging and promoting the evasion and avoidance of the payment of these taxes. So it's important, and that is one of the main reasons why some experts say that it was a good measure when the COVID-19 impacted the economy of Colombia to take these 3 days without the VAT tax. However, and most of them agree that once the economy overcome of this pandemic, it will not be necessary the 3 day free of taxes, since some even though the idea is to promote and support the commercial sector, is not giving the results that are expected of this measure.
About the territorial taxes, the 2019 to 2020 report analyzes the collection of territorial taxes between 2008 and 2016. It takes into account the lack of clarity in the nation's competencies, the heterogeneity of institutional capacity in the administration of collection, among others, affect tax efficiency and generate cost overruns for companies. On the other hand, in the 2020 to 2021 report, it's observed that this collection is analyzed from 2008 to 2018 and shows that increased by 0.1%, and the factors already mentioned in the previous report continue to affect tax efficiency and generate cost overruns for companies.
The total collection as a percentage of GDP was established at 18.8%. The speed increasing it continues to be found below Latin America countries and OECD countries. These low levels are due to the inefficiency of the tax system for a correct progressivity and efficiency of the same tax structure, the low quality of human resources, technology, and business organization. The role of this system is limited compared to tools such as the distribution of wealth in like countries belonging to the OECD. Inequality in Colombia is greater, taking into account the effect of taxes and government transfer. Another factor that limits combating inequality are subsidies exchange which benefit people with the highest incomes in a greater percentage. Faced with the efficiency of tax collection and administration in the second period, with a total GDP collection of 19.4%, being below a general average for Latin America and OECD countries. This data can be attributed to the reduced direct and indirect taxes of natural persons, administrative weaknesses, and the low price of oil in a global market, in addition to the few tools such as reliefs and exceptions. With the approval of the 2010 law of 2019, the Ministry of Finance projects greater growth, thus increasing tax revenues. However, the economic crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic affected the economy in a great negative way. Therefore, tax collection. Faced with the efficiency of tax collection and administration in the second period, with a total GDP collection of 19.4%, being below a general average for Latin America and OECD countries. This data can be attributed to the reduced direct and indirect taxes of natural persons, administrative weaknesses, and the low price of oil in a global market, in addition to the few tools such as reliefs and exceptions. With the approval of the 2010 law of 2019, the Ministry of Finance projects greater growth, thus increasing tax revenues. However, the economic crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic affected the economy in a great negative way. Therefore, tax collection. According to the last two reports, it is important to carry out a series of adjustments, among which are first, a restructuring of the institution in terms of the efficiency of technology and human resources, thus allowing an abbreviated refund of the income tax, income and VAT, which will be later be paid to the most vulnerable parts of the population, in addition to imposing laws to mitigate taxes on capital goods.
We identify that the most relevant difference when making the comparison between the two reports is the COVID-19 crisis. Since that section is not included in the 2019 2020 report. This highlights how the government has managed and adopted measures at the tax level that seek. Like the first one is giving more liquidity to people and companies in order to keep demand active, and the second one is guarantee the survival of firms and defend employment despite having limited fiscal space given the persistence of the fiscal deficit and the volume of public debt. It's that the COVID-19 crisis has generated fiscal expenditure amounting to 2.7% of GDP. Therefore, a fiscal reform of 2% of GDP is required, which will involve as adjustments on the side of the current expenses and revenues of the central national government. And it's important to mention that the solidarity tax, like COVID, was imposed from May 1, 2020 until July 31, 2020, this time destined for social investment in the vulnerable middle class and informal workers, created by Legislative Decree 568 of 2020. And finally, the last step taken with respect to the previous report is rationalize exemptions and special tax regimes, which was welcomed by Resolution 1046 of April 2020 that officially installed the Study Commission on Tax Benefits, with the aim that the Commission evaluates the convenience of exceptions and special tax regimes and proposes a reform to maintain only those benefits that are efficient. Thanks for your attention.